Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a moment in the very deepest hours of the night when the world goes utterly still. No wind, no voices, no movement at all. Just silence, total and absolute, pressing in from all sides like something alive. It is in moments like that one, right there on the edge of sleep, that the old stories feel the most real. Not like history, not like facts on a page, like something that actually happened, something you almost remember. The story I want to tell you tonight is one of those stories. It begins 10,000 years ago, give or take, in an age when humanity stood on the very precipice of something glorious, when the stars were not yet out of reach, when the greatest warriors who would ever live marched under a single banner, side by side, brothers in everything that word could possibly mean, and it ends. Where as all the most important stories end, not with victory or defeat, but with consequence, with the weight of choices made and unmade, with the long, slow silence that follows the last fire going out. This is the story of the 18 Space Marine Legions. Settle in. We have a long way to go. Part 1. Before the galaxy burned. The Emperor, the Primarchs, and the Great Crusade. You have to understand what the galaxy looked like before any of this began, because without that context, none of the rest of it makes sense. Humanity, at this point in history, is a scattered, fractured, terrified species. Thousands of years of catastrophe have reduced civilization to isolated pockets of survival across a million worlds. The age of strife, they call it, and the name is honest. Warp storms have cut off interstellar travel for centuries. Just psychers have torn apart civilizations from within. Alien empires have pushed deep into territories that were once human. Worlds that once held billions have been reduced to feudal settlements. The old technologies forgotten. The old glories turned to myth. Humanity is not flourishing. Humanity is barely surviving. And then, out of the storms, comes the Emperor. Who the Emperor of mankind actually is, where he came from, how old he truly is. These are questions that even the most learned scholars of the 41st millennium cannot answer with confidence. What is known is this. He is something beyond human, a being of incomprehensible psychic power who has walked among mankind for thousands upon thousands of years, wearing different faces, playing different roles, each guiding the species through its darkest hours in ways it never quite understood. And now, emerging from the dust and the ruins of terror, he has decided that the time for subtle guidance is over. The time for direct action has come. He unifies terror. He subdues the feudal warlords one by one, the bloody campaigns that history will remember as the Unification Wars. He builds, he plans, he reaches into the deepest sciences of a civilization long fallen and pulls forward technologies that have no right to exist in an age this barbaric. Genecraft, psychic engineering, the manipulation of the very stuff of the soul. He is building something. And what he is building is magnificent. The Primarchs are perhaps his greatest creation. Deep beneath the mountains of the Himalayan range, us in a laboratory complex so secure and so secret that its very existence was classified beyond almost any level of clearance. 20 infant beings were grown in gene vats and nurtured into early life. They were made from the Emperor's own genetic material, refined and amplified and shaped by sciences that no other living mind fully understood. Each one was designed to be superhuman in every possible way, larger than any man, stronger, faster, smarter, gifted with a charisma and a force of personality that made mortal men want to follow them to the very ends of reality. Each was built to embody a particular aspect of the warrior, the general, the leader. Together, they were meant to be the generals of a crusade that would reunite all of humanity's scattered worlds under a single banner, an Imperium spanning the entire galaxy. But before they could even be born into the world, something went wrong. Something reached out through the fabric of space and time itself and scattered them to the winds. The chaos gods, the vast and terrible entities that inhabit the dimension of psychic energy known as the warp, understood what was being built. They understood what these 20 children would mean for the future of the universe, what their purpose was, and what it would cost the powers of chaos if that purpose was fulfilled. And so, in a single act of cosmic sabotage, the incubation capsules carrying the 20 infant Primarchs were snatched from their resting place and hurled through the warp, scattered across the breadth of the galaxy to land on worlds as different from one another as it was possible for worlds to be. The Emperor was devastated. But he was not defeated. He already had samples of the Primarch's genetic material, and from those samples, he built the Space Marines. The Legiones Astartes, the Space Marine legions, began as the Emperor's stand-in army while the Primarchs were still missing. 20 legions, each grown from the genetic template of one of the lost sons, each one a force of transhuman super warriors, capable of fighting where ordinary soldiers could not survive. They took years to create, going through a brutal series of surgical and genetic augmentations that rebuilt their bodies from the inside out. Extra hearts, extra lungs that could filter toxins, bones laced with a substance harder than ordinary calcium, muscles that would put any athlete to shame, eyes that could see in darkness, a stomach that could digest almost anything, and a memory that never forgot. By the time the process was complete, a Space Marine was no longer quite human. He was something else, something harder, stronger, and arguably something more. The Emperor used these legions to begin the Great Crusade, the vast military campaign that he had always intended to launch. His forces swept out from Terra into the galaxy, world by world, system by system, bringing the scattered remnants of humanity back under a single flag. And as they went, the Emperor searched for his lost sons. One by one, he found them. The Primarchs had landed on worlds across the galaxy, growing up in conditions as varied as the worlds themselves. Some had been welcomed as gods. Some had been raised as warriors. Some had fought their way out of slavery. Or survived in absolute isolation, or built kingdoms and torn them down and built them again. Every single one of them carried the mark of their origins, shaped as much by where they had landed as by the genetic code inside them. And every single one, when the Emperor finally arrived, was faced with a choice. Most of them joined willingly. They recognized their father. They felt the pull of something greater than themselves. One by one, they took command of their legions and became something even more extraordinary. A Primarch united with his sons, leading armies of warriors who shared his blood, his instincts, his nature. Together, they pushed the Great Crusade forward at a pace that staggered history. But there is a shadow in all of this, and I want you to hold it in the back of your mind as we go through each legion. Because the same diversity that made the Primarchs extraordinary, the variety of their upbringings, the specificity of their personalities, the depth of their individual beliefs and ambitions, was also a weakness. These were not identical soldiers following a script. They were individuals. Complex, powerful, proud individuals who had each grown up with their own philosophy of what it meant to rule, to fight, to lead, to obey. And when the strains of that diversity eventually hit their breaking point, the results would be catastrophic. There is one more thing you need to know before we begin. Of the 20 legions that were created, only 18 are known to history. The 2nd Legion and the 11th Legion have been erased from all records. Their names are gone. Their Primarchs are gone. Whatever they did, or whatever was done to them, it has been buried so completely that even the most obsessive scholars of the 41st millennium can find no trace. Some suggest they were destroyed for a terrible crime. Others whisper that the Space Wolves, who had a reputation as the Emperor's executioners, were responsible for their end. The truth has never been confirmed. Perhaps it never will be. What remains are 18. 9 would stay loyal. 9 would betray everything they had been made for, and the galaxy would never be the same. Let us begin with the first. Part 2. The Dark Angels, the secrets they keep. The First Legion, the oldest, the one that was there before any of the others had found their Primarch, fighting in grey armour under the Emperor's direct command, as already battle-hardened by the time the rest of the galaxy was just beginning to understand what was happening. They are called the Dark Angels, and the name is very nearly perfect. The world that gave them their Primarch was called Caliban, a death world in the Segmentum Obscurus, close enough to the Eye of Terror to feel the psychic pressure of that cursed place in the air. Caliban was covered in forests so deep and so dark that light barely reached the ground in places, and those forests were full of things that had no business existing in a sane universe. Warp-tainted creatures, monsters that had been twisted by the same energies that leak from the Eye of Terror, growing huge and aggressive and wrong in ways that made experienced hunters feel something they were not used to feeling, which was fear. As the human population had been forced to retreat behind massive stone fortresses, feudal castles hacked out of the forest, their survival dependent on the warrior orders that defended them. It was in one of those forests, alone, without a name, that the infant Primarch of the First Legion survived. How long he was alone, nobody knows for certain. The Calibanites found him eventually, a young being of obvious extraordinary nature, who had somehow managed to survive in conditions that would have killed ordinary men without a weapon or a warm fire. He was named by the knights of the warrior order that discovered him, Lion L. Johnson. In the old Calibanite dialect, the name means something close to the lion, son of the forest, and it was given honestly, because the boy who would become a Primarch was golden-haired, fierce-eyed, and radiated a quality that made even veteran warriors instinctively step back and give him space. He became close with the Order, the warrior brotherhood that found him, and particularly with a knight named Luther. Luther was one of the great warriors of Caliban, respected and capable and genuinely devoted to the Order's ideals. Between him and the Lion, something formed that was not exactly friendship, but was something perhaps more valuable. A partnership of equals who pushed each other toward greatness. They rose together through the ranks. They campaigned together across Caliban, the Lion always a step ahead, always the one who saw the larger pattern, always the one who got the songs written about him afterward. That last part, small as it sounds, was where the first crack appeared. Luther was extraordinary, but the Lion was more extraordinary. And no matter how hard Luther tried, no matter how many monsters he killed or how many battles he won, the Lion always shone just a little brighter. It is a small thing, the kind of thing that eats at a person slowly rather than all at once. Luther was loyal, but deep in some chamber of his heart where he preferred not to look too closely, he was also envious. The Great Crusade arrived on Caliban, and the Lion accepted his place at the head of the First Legion, with the ease of someone stepping into a role they had been born for. He began to shape the Legion in his own image, drawing on both the ancient traditions of the Terran-born warriors who had served the Emperor since before Caliban had ever been found, and the martial codes of the Order that had raised him. And he created something he called the Hexagrammaton, the 6 wings of the Legion, each one dedicated to a different aspect of warfare: the Death Wing, the Raven Wing, the Dread Wing, the Fire Wing, the Iron Wing, the Storm Wing. It was elegant and ferociously effective. The Dark Angels fought as an integrated system, every component reinforcing every other, and they were devastating. They were also complicated, in the way that all the best things are complicated. Luther was sent back to Caliban. The official reason was to oversee recruitment and garrison the Legion's homeworld. The unofficial reason, the one that many who watched it happen suspected without ever saying aloud, was that the Lion found it easier to lead without someone like Luther around, someone who remembered him before he was a Primarch, or someone who knew how to read him in ways his sons did not. Whatever the reason, it was a decision that would prove catastrophic, because Luther, alone on Caliban, with the warriors who had been left behind, and who had begun to share his growing sense of abandonment and resentment, was eventually approached by something from the warp, something that was very good at finding the cracks in people's armor and pressing on them very gently until they split wide open. And Luther, who had spent years watching his closest friend eclipse him again and again, who had been exiled to guard a backwater planet while the Great Crusade went on without him, found that something in him was willing to listen. The Horus heresy broke the galaxy in half. The lion fought on the side of the Emperor, but not in the way that most histories tell it. Whereas the Dark Angels were entangled in the Thramas Crusade, a brutal campaign against the Night Lords far from terror. And by the time the lion understood the full scope of what was happening, the final battles were already underway. He raced for terror, but missed the climactic moments of the siege. When it was over, he brought his fleet back to Caliban, expecting to find his homeworld waiting. What he found instead was orbital defense batteries opening fire on his ships. Luther had declared independence. He had turned the garrison into a rebel force. The chaos energies that had been working on him for years had finally completed their work. And when the lion arrived, he found not his sanctuary, but his enemy. What followed was a bombardment and a battle, and finally a duel between the two men who had been, once upon a time, closer than brothers. It destroyed Caliban, literally destroyed it, the planet itself being torn apart by the energies unleashed in the final confrontation. The lion was grievously wounded. Luther's mind was shattered. The Dark Angels who had stood with Luther were scattered through time and space by the dying warp energies of the planet, flung into the 41st millennium, or earlier or later, each one appearing somewhere across the galaxy as a phantom from a civil war that official history does not acknowledge. These were the fallen angels, and they are the Dark Angels' great and terrible secret, because some of those fallen are still out there. 10,000 years later, they are still appearing, and the Dark Angels, whose inner circle knows the full truth of what happened on Caliban, would have made the hunting of every last fallen angel the chapter's highest priority. Not just a military objective, but a spiritual imperative. Because in the eyes of the Supreme Grand Master and the Inner Circle, the chapter cannot be forgiven for what happened until every fallen has been found and made to repent, or is destroyed. The lion himself disappeared the night Caliban died, taken by the mysterious Watchers in the dark to somewhere deep within the remains of the planet, now called the Rock, the Dark Angels' mobile fortress monastery. He slept there, healing from wounds that should have killed him, for 10,000 years. And then, in the current era of Warhammer 40,000, the 41st millennium giving way to the 42nd, and the Imperium fracturing under pressure from every direction simultaneously, the lion woke up. But he is out there now, carrying the Emperor's shield, fighting in a galaxy he barely recognizes, trying to understand what 10 millennia of absence has meant. The chapter he created still carries his genetic legacy. They still wear green armor, though it began as black and changed to green after the heresy. They still operate in layers of secrecy within secrecy. The outer companies knowing nothing of the fallen. The inner circle knowing everything. The most senior officers knowing truths that would shatter the faith of anyone who heard them without preparation. They are the Dark Angels. They keep their secrets like the forests of Caliban kept theirs. Part 3. The Space Wolves, the Emperor's executioners. If the Dark Angels are defined by what they hide, the Space Wolves are defined by what they refuse to hide at all. And they are called the Vulkafenrika, in their own language, the Wolves of Fenris, though outsiders have been calling them the Space Wolves for long enough that the name has stuck even in their own informal speech. They are the 6th Legion. Their Primarch is Leman Russ, and they are, without question, one of the most recognizable forces in the entire history of the Adeptus Astartes. Their homeworld, Fenris, is a particular kind of brutal. The planet exists in an elliptical orbit that swings it alternately close to its star and far from it, which means its seasons are not the gentle rhythm of spring and summer and autumn and winter. They are extremes. During the deep winter, the entire ocean freezes over, and the islands that dot that ocean become connected by a vast plain of ice across which the scattered human tribes can travel. During the short, violent summer, the planet swings close to its sun and the heat becomes catastrophic. The ice melts. The volcanoes erupt. Entire islands sink beneath newly risen seas. The tribes must scatter or drown. Every few years, the map of Fenris changes completely. The people who survive this are not soft. They are fierce, independent, fiercely tribal, technically at what an outside observer would classify as a late Iron Age level of development. And they are among the best fighters per capita of any human population in the Imperium. They have to be. Being weak on Fenris is not a lifestyle choice. It is a death sentence. Into this world fell the infant Primarch. He was found by wolves, raised among them as something they recognized as kin. When humans finally found him, he was already a force of nature, as something feral and magnificent that existed in the space between human and wolf, belonging entirely to neither. The tribal king who took him in, Thengir of the Rus tribe, was wise enough to recognize what he had found rather than fear it. Leman grew among his adopted people, learned their language and their ways, became eventually their king. He was called Leman of the Rus, and then just Leman Rus. And the stories they told about him were the kind that start as tall tales and end as religion. The Emperor came to Fenris personally to retrieve his lost son, and Leman, who had not yet had reason to bow to anyone, tested him. He beat the Emperor in an eating contest. He beat the Emperor in a drinking contest. When it came to fighting, the Emperor struck Leman down with a single blow. The Wolf King accepted this outcome cheerfully, got up, and pledged his loyalty to the man who had just knocked him unconscious. On Fenris, you respect the person who can put you on the ground. It is the most honest form of introduction there is. Leman Russ took command of the 6th Legion and transformed it in his own image, or rather, in the image of Fenris, because the two had become the same thing. He renamed them the Vulca Fenrica. He restructured them around the concept of the Great Companies, 13 packs of warriors, each led by a Jarl, arranged not like a conventional military hierarchy, but like the tribal structure of his homeworld. Where other legions drilled in formal parade ground lines, the Space Wolves trained like hunters. Where other legions spoke of duty and protocol, the Space Wolves spoke of loyalty to the pack and glory in the hunt. There was a reputation that grew around them during the Great Crusade, the reputation of being the Emperor's executioners, because when another legion overstepped, when a Primarch needed to be reined in, when the Emperor required someone willing to do the kind of work that other legions would have complicated feelings about afterward, he sent Leman Russ. The Space Wolves did not ask many questions. They were loyal, unconditionally, completely, absolutely loyal. And that made them exactly what the Emperor needed when the situation called not for glory, but for blunt, brutal, unflinching obedience. There are strong suggestions in the historical record that this included the fate of the Lost Legions, the 2nd and the 11th, what they did and what the Space Wolves did in response. Bushes has been erased from history so thoroughly that even speculation is dangerous, but the pattern is there for anyone willing to look. The Emperor needed an instrument of internal punishment. He built the Space Wolves that way deliberately. And the Space Wolves, because they were completely loyal, never questioned why. The relationship between the Space Wolves and the Thousand Sons is one of the most charged and tragic dynamics in the entire history of the Legions. Leman Russ despised Psykers. He had grown up on a world where the relationship between humanity and the supernatural was understood entirely in terms of threat and survival, where anything that smelled of warpcraft was something to be destroyed before it could destroy you. Magnus the Red, the Primarch of the Thousand Sons, was a Psyker so powerful that ordinary people in his presence could feel reality bending slightly around him. The two were never going to be friends. When Magnus used his immense psychic powers to communicate a warning directly to the Emperor, ripping through the warp unannounced in a desperate attempt to stop Horus's corruption before it could spread further, the Emperor interpreted this as the gravest possible act of disobedience. Magnus had sworn an oath at the Council of Nicaea not to practice sorcery. He had broken that oath in the most dramatic way imaginable, and the Emperor, furious, ordered that the Space Wolves bring Magnus back to Terra for judgment. But Horus intervened. He altered the orders. changed them from arrest to annihilation. And Leman Russ, not knowing what had been changed or why, descended on the Thousand Sons homeworld of Prospero with the full force of his legion and burned it. It was one of the great tragedies of the Horus heresy, and it was in many ways Horus's opening move. Because destroying Prospero turned Magnus, who had actually been trying to help the Emperor, into a traitor. It gave Tzeentch exactly the broken, furious, desperate man he needed to add to his collection. During the Horus heresy itself, the Space Wolves were kept at arm's length from Terra's final defense. Horus had deployed the Alpha Legion against them specifically to slow them down, trapping them in the Alax's Nebula in a protracted engagement that kept them far from the critical battles. They fought their way through, but by the time they reached the center of events, the Siege of Terra was over. After the heresy, as the Space Wolves refused to comply fully with the Codex Astartes, the great restructuring document written by Gilliman that broke the legions into smaller chapters. They agreed to divide, technically, but the resulting Space Wolves chapter was not Codex compliant in any meaningful sense, and the second chapter born from the split, the Wolf Brothers, suffered from severe gene seed mutations and was disbanded within a few centuries. The Space Wolves stand alone. Leman Russ himself departed Fenris in the year 211 of the 32nd millennium, during the annual feast celebrating the Emperor's ascension. He gathered his most trusted warriors, the Varagir, his bodyguard. He told his chapter that he was going somewhere, and that he would return for what the Fenrisians call the Wolf Time, the final battle at the end of the universe. And then he walked into the Eye of Terror and did not come back. Bjorn the Fell-Handed, the oldest living space marine in the galaxy, remembers the day it happened. He was there. The Space Wolves wait for their king. They fight without him. But they wait. Part 4. The White Scars and the Ultramarines. Speed and discipline. There is a contrast worth sitting with for a moment between the 5th and the 13th Legions, between the White Scars and the Ultramarines, because these two legions, in many ways, represent two very different answers to the same question of how you build something that lasts. The White Scars are the 5th Legion. Their primarch is Jagatai Khan, and he grew up on a world called Chagoris, a great steppe planet whose endless plains bred a nomadic horse culture of extraordinary ferocity. The Khan rose through that culture the hard way, unifying the disparate tribes of Chagoris through a combination of military genius and sheer personal dominance, creating an empire on his homeworld before the Emperor ever arrived. He was called the Kargan by his people, and the title stuck. He was not warm in the way that Sanguinius was warm, nor wise in the way that Gilliman was wise. He was quick, mercurial. He valued speed above all other tactical virtues and had a philosopher's mind that his enemies consistently underestimated. The White Scars fought like their homeworld had taught them to fight. Fast, mobile, striking without warning from unexpected angles, never standing still long enough to become a target, never giving the enemy time to react before the position had already changed. On Chagoris, the great horse armies had defeated larger forces by never fighting on the enemy's terms. The White Scars applied the same philosophy to the Void and to the killing grounds of alien worlds, their bikes and fast assault craft replacing the warhorses of the steppe. During the Horus heresy, the White Scars were engaged in a distant campaign against the Orcs of the Kondak system, so far from the center of events that the Alpha Legion had been specifically deployed to block their communications and prevent them from learning what was happening. When the jamming was eventually broken, partly through the intervention of elements within the Alpha Legion itself, the Kagan found himself in the position of having to choose a side without complete information. He chose the Emperor, not out of blind loyalty, but out of a process of reasoning and evidence gathering that speaks to exactly how his mind worked. He refused to be rushed. He went to Prospero first to see what had happened there. He gathered what information he could, and then he came to Terra. He arrived in time to play a crucial role in the Siege of Terra. his legion's speed allowing them to strike deep into traitor lines in ways that more conventional forces could not manage. After the heresy, the Khan was one of the Primarchs who supported the Codex Astartes and the breaking of the legions into chapters. He understood the argument Guilliman was making. He understood why centralizing too much power in any single force was dangerous. The Khagan's current status is one of the Imperium's ongoing mysteries. He followed something into the webway. It's the secret network of interdimensional passages that runs through the underbelly of the galaxy and never came back. He is listed as missing rather than dead, and his chapter holds onto that distinction fiercely. Now, the Ultramarines. Robute Guilliman, 13th Legion, the Primarch who arguably did more to shape the Imperium as it exists in the 41st millennium than any other single figure, including, arguably, the Emperor himself. Guilliman was found on Macragge, a world in a region of space that would eventually be called Ultramar, and he grew up fast, not in the way that some Primarchs grew, through violence and isolation, but through governance. He had been taken in by the ruling consul of Macragge as an infant, and by the time the Emperor arrived to retrieve him, he had already transformed Macragge and its surrounding systems into a model of efficient, well-governed civilization. He did not just fight, he built, he administered, he made things work, and the legion that bore his genetic legacy reflected this perfectly. The Ultramarines became the largest legion in history. At the height of the Great Crusade, they numbered in the tens of thousands, vastly more than any other legion. They were methodical, disciplined, adaptable, and governed by doctrine in the way that a great machine is governed by engineering. Everything fitted precisely where it needed to be. They did not have the ferocity of the Space Wolves or the psychic gifts of the Thousand Suns, but they were arguably the most balanced military force ever assembled. They could fight any enemy on any terrain, in any tactical situation, and bring the correct response to bear with a reliability that made other Primarchs slightly uncomfortable. The Word-Bearers hit them hard during the Horus Heresy at the Battle of Calth, an ambush so devastating that it crippled the Ultramarines' ability to come to Terra's aid and left the two legions locked in a subterranean war for years. But the Ultramarines survived because they were built by someone who understood that survival is not just about winning battles. It is about having the structures in place to recover from defeat. Guilliman rebuilt. He led what was called Imperium Secundus, a parallel Imperium he tried to establish in Ultramar when the Ruinstorm cut off communication with Terra, even briefly accepting a kind of joint rule with Sanguinius and the Lion. He was not perfect in this period. His relationship with his brothers during Imperium Secundus was strained and complicated, and occasionally politically disastrous. But he was trying, which is more than can be said for many. After the heresy, Guilliman wrote the Codex Astartes. It is difficult to overstate how important this document is. The Codex Astartes is the foundational military and organizational doctrine of the Space Marines as they exist today. It mandated that the surviving loyalist legions be broken into chapters of approximately 1,000 warriors each. It specified that no single commander would ever again control a force of legion-scale magnitude. It described in exhaustive detail the organization, training, tactical doctrine, and chain of command for a standard Space Marine chapter. It is, in essence, the constitution of the Adeptus Astartes. Most Primarchs accepted this, some reluctantly. Rogel Dawn held out for a long time before finally agreeing. The Space Wolves never really agreed at all in any meaningful practical sense, but the structure held, and the Imperium that Guilliman built in the aftermath of the heresy is the one that persists into the 41st millennium, the one we call the Imperium of Man. Guilliman himself was mortally wounded by the demon Primarch Fulgrim not long after the heresy ended, and was placed in a stasis field aboard the Macragge ship Titus. He remained there for 10,000 years. Then, in the 41st millennium, Archmagos Dominus Belisarius Cawl and Inquisitor Catarina Greyfax found a way to remove him from stasis, and Guilliman woke up into a galaxy that had spent 10 millennia failing to live up to what he had built. He wept for it, according to the accounts. Then he put on his armor, took up his father's sword, and went back to work. He is the Lord Commander of the Imperium now. He is not happy about what he has found, but he is working. Part 5. The Imperial Fists and the Blood Angels, Walls and Wings. 2 legions, very different from one another, who shared the same final theatre, who both fought and bled and endured through the darkest hours of the Siege of Terror. Rogel Dawn, 7th Legion, the Imperial Fists. He was found on a great star fort drifting through space, the Phalanx, which would become his legion's home and fortress monastery, a ship city so vast that it had its own atmosphere and was effectively a mobile world. Dawn had been running it, alone, maintaining its systems and defending it from borders. By the time the Emperor found him, he was already, in some fundamental way, exactly what he would always be. A man who understood fortification at an almost spiritual level, who believed that defense was not just a military tactic, but a virtue, that the wall built to shelter the innocent was a holy act. He joined the Emperor immediately, with no tests and no challenges. The stories say he simply looked at the Emperor and understood what he was looking at, and that was enough. His loyalty from that moment was absolute and would remain absolute until the day he died. The Imperial Fists were not the most numerous legion. They were not the most aggressive or the most inventive, but they were possibly the most reliable. Where other legions had their moments of brilliance and their moments of catastrophic failure, the Fists were consistent. They could take any position and hold it. They could build any fortification and defend it. The wall of the Imperial Palace on Terra was Rogel Dawn's work, and even when Horus brought the full weight of a traitor coalition against it, it held. That said, Dawn was not without his flaws. He could be inflexible. His inability to tell a lie was both his greatest virtue and his occasional weakness, because the situations that demanded diplomatic evasion, rather than blunt truth, were more numerous than he preferred. His guilt about not having detected Horus's corruption sooner was something he carried for the rest of his life in the form of the Chamber of Penance, where he had himself locked without food or water for days at a time to contemplate his failures. He survived the heresy. He survived the Siege of Terror, defending the palace with a ferocity that became legendary. He died later, boarding the Chaos battleship Sword of Sacrilege during a campaign in the Chaos-ravaged post-heresy universe. His hand was recovered. His body was not. He is listed as dead, but the Imperial Fists maintain that severed hand as a relic, and some among them believe, as some always will, that their father might yet return. Now, the Blood Angels, Sanguinius, 9th Legion, the Great Angel. He fell on Baal Secundus, one of 2 moons orbiting a world called Baal, both of which were radioactive wastelands created by the nuclear civil wars of the Age of Strife. He was found by the pure-blooded human tribes of this poisoned place, a golden child with wings growing from his back, with eyes that saw things others could not, with a presence that made even mutant hordes stop and stare before the instinct to destroy kicked back in. He fought the mutants. He united the tribes. He created order in a desert world that had not known order in generations. He was, by any reasonable assessment, the most physically beautiful of the Primarchs. Golden, winged, radiant in a way that made people describe encounters with him in the kind of language that religious texts use for angels and saints. He was also, genuinely, profoundly kind, which was perhaps rarer among the Primarchs than the beauty. He loved his sons. He worried about them. He kept their darkest secret for as long as he possibly could, the Red Thirst, as that is what it is called. Deep within the gene seed of the Blood Angels, inherited from some quality in Sanguinius's own psychic and genetic makeup, there is something that pulls at a Blood Angel in battle. A hunger, a craving for the blood of the enemy so intense that it can overwhelm rational thought. Warriors who succeed in controlling it are some of the most formidable fighters in the Imperium, channeling that hunger into a ferocity that makes them terrifying. Warriors who cannot control it descend into something else, something that the chapter is ashamed of and desperately tries to manage. For those who fall too deep into the Red Thirst, the Black Rage waits. The Black Rage is a psychic wound that did not exist until Sanguinius died, when Horus killed him at the end of the Siege of Terra. Something in the genetic memory of every Blood Angel and their successor chapters was permanently marked. The moment of Sanguinius's death, his final furious battle against the arch-traitor, is encoded in the gene seed. And sometimes, on the eve of battle or in the heat of combat, a Blood Angel will be suddenly pulled backward in time and become Sanguinius in those final moments.
Okay, I want to pause here for just a second because honestly, this is the part of 40k lore that got me, like properly got me. I've been into this hobby for a while now, and I remember the first time I actually sat down and read through the heresy properly, not just the wiki summaries, not just the codex lore blurbs, but I actually followed it from the Great Crusade all the way to the Siege of Terra. And there's this moment when you realize that these weren't just evil guys who turned evil because the story needed villains. These were brothers, genuinely. They trained together, bled together, conquered entire star systems standing side by side, and then it all collapsed. What gets me every single time is Sanguinius. Every time, because he knew. He saw his own death coming and he walked toward it anyway. That's not a tragedy written into a character. That's something a lot deeper than most fiction even tries to reach. I don't know, maybe that says something about why 40k resonates so hard. It doesn't do clean endings. It doesn't do redemption arcs where everything works out. It just shows you something real about loyalty and loss and what people are willing to carry. And then it keeps going. But anyways, that's just my 2 cents. Let's go back to the video.
He will see what Sanguinius saw. He will feel what Sanguinius felt. He will fight not the enemy in front of him, but the arch-traitor Horus, over and over again, with a grief and fury that knows no bottom. Warriors taken by the Black Rage cannot be saved. They are placed in the Death Company, their black armor painted with red crosses to signify the wounds of Sanguinius, and they are sent into the most dangerous assaults, seeking the honorable death in combat that lets them die as warriors, rather than fade slowly in the Tower of the Lost on Bol, howling at walls that do not answer. Sanguinius knew about the Red Thirst before the heresy. He had been hiding it from the Emperor, desperate to find a cure before anyone found out, afraid of what it would mean for his legion if the true nature of the flaw became known. It was one of the truest expressions of his character that he was willing to carry that burden alone, that his first instinct was to protect rather than to ask for help. During the Siege of Terra, Sanguinius was separated from the main force when his ship was boarded. He fought his way through and eventually, battered and exhausted, reached the bridge of Horus's flagship, the Vengeful Spirit. He faced the War Master alone. What was said between them is not recorded in any source that fully agrees with any other. What is known is that he was killed. Horus killed him personally, and the psychic wave that rippled out from that death hit every Blood Angel simultaneously and triggered the first collective onset of the Black Rage. Then the Emperor arrived. The Blood Angels endure. They fight in Sanguinius's memory, beautiful and deadly, and carrying within them a grief that has never fully healed. A wound passed from father to son to son to son across 10,000 years. Commander Dante, their chapter master, is the oldest living space marine outside of a dreadnought sarcophagus, over 1,000 years old, and he has spent every single one of those years searching for a cure that has not yet come. They hope, they grieve, they fight. To part 6, Iron Hands and Salamanders, the Flesh and the Forge, 2 legions whose primarchs both landed in fire, metaphorically speaking, and who emerged from it with completely opposite philosophies about what the experience meant. Ferrus Manus, the Gorgon, 10th Legion. His incubation capsule struck the death world of Medusa with enough force to topple a mountain and trigger earthquakes across the planet. Medusa was a world of constant tectonic instability, choking ash clouds, and sparse, brutal resources. The nomadic clans that survived there were hard people by necessity, because the planet gave no quarter and expected none. Ferrus grew up in isolation, alone on this tectonically violent world, until his deeds became too large to remain unknown. His hands are the defining detail. There was a creature on Medusa, possibly of Necron origin, a massive biomechanical worm called a Cyanoth the silver worm. Ferrus hunted it. He eventually killed it by plunging it into a river of lava, but in doing so, he plunged his own hands into that lava as well, holding the worm under with raw physical power. The silver metal of the worm bonded to his hands and forearms, permanently, the material flowing into his flesh and hardening there. His hands were silver ever after. Necrodermis, the same material from which the Necrons build their eternal bodies. He could shape metal with them as though it were soft clay. He was the greatest weaponsmith among the Primarchs, forging blades and hammers and bolters of such quality that other Primarchs carried his gifts as their most prized possessions. He was not a man for sentiment. Ferrus Manus believed that weakness, as any weakness, was the enemy, and he believed that the flesh was inherently weak. The Iron Hands absorbed this philosophy utterly. They replace flesh with metal, voluntarily and eagerly. First the hand, traditionally in memory of their founder, but then the arm, the eye, sections of the chest and spine. To an Iron Hand, cybernetics are not a last resort imposed by injury. They are an aspiration, the perfection of the self through the removal of biological frailty. Ferrus was perhaps the most tragic of the Loyalist deaths during the heresy. He was killed early, at the Dropsite massacre, by the hand of his closest brother, by Fulgrim, the Primarch of the Emperor's children, who had fallen to chaos and who stood across from him on the black sand of Istvan Fife with a demonic sword and performed the most personal betrayal of the entire civil war. Fulgrim cut off his head and presented it to Horus as a trophy. The Iron Hands who survived became something harder and colder than they had been before. They still replace flesh with metal, but now they also have a contempt for biological limitation that borders on self-hatred. Their fallen Primarch is honoured, but also cited as evidence of the weakness of flesh, because flesh, even the flesh of a Primarch, can be cut. Across the galaxy from Medusa, another Primarch grew up in fire. Vulcan, the 18th Legion, salamanders. Nocturne is a world of active volcanoes and brutal heat, lit by a massive star that burns with an intensity that would cripple unprotected humans. The Nocturnians have adapted. Their melanochrome, an organ all Space Marines carry, but which behaves differently in each Legion's gene seed, has adapted to protect them from Nocturne's radiation by darkening their skin to an obsidian black. Vulcan grew among these people, became their champion and their protector. The Salamanders are unique among the Legions in one central respect. They care about the people they fight for in a way that other Legions, by and large, do not. Most chapters keep the civilian population at arm's length, seeing ordinary humans as something to be defended in abstract terms, like a resource rather than a community. The Salamanders, shaped by Vulcan's philosophy and his time among the forge workers and miners of Nocturne, see things differently. They fight for individuals. They make weapons and armor for the ordinary citizens of worlds they visit. They refuse orders that require excessive civilian casualties, even when the tactical calculus would favor accepting those casualties. They are, by the standards of the 41st Millennium, extraordinarily compassionate. Vulcan is also a perpetual, one of the extremely rare human beings who are functionally immortal, able to die and return to life with no permanent consequence. He was killed during the Dropsite massacre and captured afterward, subjected to horrific torture by Conrad Kurz, the Night Haunter, Primarch of the Night Lords, who made a project of killing Vulcan in every way possible and watching him come back. Eventually, Vulcan escaped. Eventually, he returned to his Legion. And eventually he walked out into the galaxy alone, carrying one final mission, and has not been seen since. The Salamanders hold to the saying that Vulcan lives. They believe it. And given what Vulcan is, they might be right. Part 7. The Raven Guard. Shadows and Ashes. Corvus Corax, the Raven Lord, 19th Legion. There is a melancholy to the Raven Guard that runs all the way through their history, a quality of darkness that is not malice, but grief. the shadow of something bright that was extinguished before it could fully bloom. Deliverance. That is what the moon is called now. Before Corax came, it was called Lycaeus, and it was a prison world. The surface of the moon had been given over entirely to the mining and manufacturing operations of the planet below, Kievar, whose industrial oligarchs had turned Lycaeus into a slave colony. The workers were prisoners, their children were prisoners, their grandchildren were prisoners. Generation after generation, born into chains and worked until they died in the dark mines beneath the surface. Corax was the child of those prisoners. He grew up understanding what it meant to be completely powerless, to have your humanity stripped away by the machinery of oppression, to watch the people you loved work to death while the privileged classes above ate and drank and barely noticed. And so, when the psychic gifts that came with being a Primarch began to manifest, and when the charisma that comes with being a son of the Emperor made people follow him, he led a revolution. He organized the prisoners. He taught them to fight. But he led them up from the mines and took Lycaeus for themselves, and eventually the world below had no choice but to deal with the liberated moon as an equal. He renamed it Deliverance, because that is what he had given his people. The Raven Guard fight in shadow. Where the Space Wolves are direct and ferocious and unapologetically loud, the Raven Guard are silence. They are the operatives who arrive where no one expected them, who hit the target that was supposed to be completely safe, who are gone before the enemy has finished falling. Corax himself was gifted with a psychic ability to be unnoticed, to slip past attention and perception in ways that bordered on literal invisibility. His sons inherited a version of this quality, and it shaped everything about how they approach war. Watched the Istvan V massacre hurt the Raven Guard in ways that went beyond casualties. Corax escaped, barely, and spent the next phase of the heresy attempting to rebuild his devastated legion using a sample of undifferentiated Primarch gene seed that the Emperor had given him personally. The Alpha Legion infiltrated this process, corrupting the genetic material, and the soldiers born from the tainted seed were monsters. They had to be destroyed. Corax was left with a fraction of the force he had hoped for, and the weight of having killed his own sons. He fought through to the end of the heresy. He helped defend the Imperium during the Scouring, the great campaign that drove the traitor legions back to the Eye of Terror after Horus fell. And then, one day, he sent a message to his legion saying only the word nevermore, and walked into the Eye of Terror alone, like Leman Russ, like Jaghatai Khan. His fate is unknown, missing. The Raven Guard hold his memory and fight in his shadow, as dark and precise and lethal as he was. Part 8. The Drop Site Massacre. The day Trust died. We have to stop here. We have to talk about what happened on Istvan V. Because everything that comes after, everything about the 9 traitor legions and the nature of their betrayal and the shape of the Horus heresy itself, begins on that black sand. The setup is important. Horus has already begun his rebellion. He has already made his choices. On Istvan III, he virus-bombed the loyal elements of his own legion, along with the loyal elements of the other 3 legions under his direct command, the World Eaters, as the Death Guard and the Emperor's children, killing tens of thousands of his own men because their loyalty to the Emperor meant they could not be trusted. The survivors fought back from the surface in an act of desperate heroism before being silenced. The galaxy knew now that Horus was in open revolt. 5 legions were dispatched to deal with him. The plan called for 2 waves. The first wave, the Iron Hands under Ferrus Manus, the Raven Guard under Corvus Corax, and the Salamanders under Vulcan, would make planetfall and engage Horus's forces directly. A second wave, comprising 4 more legions, the Night Lords, the Iron Warriors, the Wordbearers, and the Alpha Legion, would follow and reinforce. What the first wave did not know was that those second wave legions had already gone over to Horus. Picture the scene on Istvan V, on the black sands of the Urgal Depression, a vast flat killing ground surrounded by ridgelines. The first wave lands under fire, fights its way through brutal resistance, takes enormous casualties, and finally secures the drop site. Ferrus Manus, furious and impatient, and already straining against the battle plan's constraints, cannot stop himself from charging forward to engage Fulgrim, his closest brother, the one whose fall to chaos he cannot bring himself to fully believe is real. He takes his best veterans and rushes ahead, leaving the rest of the first wave behind him. Corax and Vulcan see the trap closing, but it is too late to stop it. The first wave, battered and strung out and still believing that their brothers are arriving to support them, turns to see those brothers opening fire. But all 4 second wave legions simultaneously turning their weapons on the survivors of the first wave. The nightmare of it, the sheer cognitive impossibility of what is happening, cost many of the loyalists precious seconds of reaction time. Seconds they could not afford. What followed was a slaughter that has been called the worst single defeat in Imperial history. Tens of thousands of loyal Space Marines surrounded on a killing ground, being cut down by warriors who until that moment had been their brothers. Some fought back, many died, without understanding what was happening. The black sands of the Urgal Depression drank deeply that day. Ferrus Manus, ahead of everyone, engaged Fulgrim in single combat. The two of them had been the closest of brothers, their bond built on a shared love of craftsmanship and a mutual respect for each other's abilities that neither had ever quite managed to articulate. Now Fulgrim stood before him with a demonic sword, and eyes full of a Slaneshi corruption so complete that the man inside it barely existed anymore. Ferrus refused to believe it, even as the blade rose. He died on those black sands, decapitated by the sword of someone he had loved, and the severed head was carried to Horus as a gift. Corax escaped, barely. Vulcan disappeared and was later found, captured by Kurz. The Salamanders suffered catastrophic losses. The Raven Guard were nearly destroyed. The Iron Hands were shattered, their Primarch dead, their senior officers killed in the initial massacre, and the survivors forced to flee without a clear chain of command or any way to understand what had just happened to them. The 3 surviving legions were called the Shattered Legions afterward. They regrouped and fought a guerrilla campaign against the traitor legions across multiple worlds, driven by grief and rage, and the terrible clarity that comes from having looked betrayal directly in the face and survived. They were instrumental in multiple operations that slowed the traitor advance toward Terra, and their contributions to the eventual loyalist victory are incalculable, but they paid a price that never fully healed. Remember the drop site massacre when we talk about the traitor legions. Because the betrayal at Istvan Fightful was not just a military event, and it was the moment when the Horus heresy stopped being a distant abstraction and became something personal for every loyalist in the galaxy. It was the moment when the word brother stopped meaning what it used to mean. Part 9. The first 4 traitors. Sons of Horus, World Eaters, Emperor's Children, and Death Guard. Let us not pretend that the traitor legions were simple villains. Some of them were. Some of them slid into their corruption with what feels, from a certain angle, like inevitability. But most of them are complicated in ways that make the story richer and sadder and more honest. The 16th Legion began as the Lunar Wolves. Horus Lupercal, their Primarch, was the first of the Primarchs to be found by the Emperor, and for a long time he was the favourite son. He was magnificent in every way that the word could apply. As a warrior of extraordinary capability, a general of genius, a leader of men whose personal charisma was such that ordinary humans wept with joy just to be in his presence. He was named War Master, given supreme command of the entire Great Crusade, an honour unprecedented in the history of the Imperium. And it was the War Master who was corrupted, not some lesser figure, the greatest of them. The corruption came through Davin, a world that the Lunar Wolves had visited twice. The second visit, Horus was struck by a weapon tainted with chaos energies and fell into a near-death state. His men, desperate, brought him to a chaos temple hoping for a cure. What they got was not a cure. What they got was Horus being exposed to the full power of the ruinous powers in a state where his psychic defenses were down. it being shown a vision of a future in which the Emperor had abandoned his sons in favor of a purely mechanical godhood where the Primarchs were discarded tools. The vision was not the truth, but it was designed to feel like the truth, and to feel like it in a way that hit every insecurity and resentment that Horus had been quietly accumulating for years. When he came out of the temple, he was not entirely himself anymore. He renamed the Legion the Sons of Horus, a name he had initially resisted on the grounds of humility, but now accepted with something darker than pride. He began to plan. He moved with absolute purpose, bringing the traitor coalition together piece by piece, exploiting the specific weaknesses of each brother Primarch with ruthless precision. The Sons of Horus were at the center of every major action of the heresy, as the legion around which everything else orbited. After the heresy, after Horus died on the vengeful spirit, the legion fell into chaos, literally and figuratively. Without Horus, they were nothing, a superweapon whose trigger finger had been cut off. They became the Black Legion under Abaddon the Despoiler, Horus's most senior surviving officer, who took the name as an act of mourning and rededication. The Black Legion is the largest and most feared of the Chaos Space Marine forces in the 41st Millennium, the 12th Legion, the World Eaters, Angron. Angron's story begins before the heresy, in a history that would have made anyone sympathize with the rage that defined him even before the warp got involved. He fell on a world where he was enslaved and forced to fight as a gladiator. He led a slave rebellion, but he gathered a band of fighters who loved him, who were willing to die beside him for the simple reason that he was the only person who had ever treated them like human beings. The Emperor arrived on that world and found Angron on a hill surrounded by the remnants of his band, about to make a final stand against an army that would certainly kill them all. The Emperor teleported Angron up to his fleet, alone. He left the men and women who had bled with Angron to die on that hill because he did not have time to save them, because the military situation did not allow for it, because strategically speaking, it did not matter. He did not ask Angron. He simply acted. Angron never forgot. He never forgave. He also carried the butcher's nails, crude psychosurgical implants that had been hammered into his skull by his slave masters, were designed to short-circuit the natural emotional processing of the human brain and replace it with a direct pathway to aggressive rage. They could not be removed without killing him. They buzzed constantly in his head, an endless pressure that meant happiness was beyond him, but anger was always right there. Easy, immediate, available. They were slowly killing him, and they shaped every aspect of how he thought and felt and led. The World Eaters absorbed his rage wholesale. Under the influence of the butcher's nails, which Angron began spreading through his legion, they became progressively more savage, more violent, more difficult to control even for their own commanders. By the time the heresy arrived, the World Eaters were less a military force, and more an instrument of pure slaughter, pointed at the enemy and released. When Angron fell fully to chaos and became a demon prince of Khorne, he ascended to something that the blood god probably considered a work of art. Angron still exists in the 41st Millennium. He has been summoned back to the material world multiple times, most notably during an invasion of Armageddon in which the Blood Angels and their successors fought to drive him back at enormous cost. He is the Red Angel now, a being of pure violence so enormous that fighting him is less like a battle and more like a geological event. He is not coming back. The Third Legion, the Emperor's children, Fulgrim. Fulgrim was perfection. That was his gift and his curse, the quality that made him brilliant and beautiful and ultimately lost. He was the master of his own body and every art it could produce. From swordsmanship to music to oratory to combat theory, his legion reflected this, becoming the most disciplined and precise of all the legions. Each warrior a perfectionist who trained obsessively at whatever his specialty was, pushing toward an ideal that could never quite be reached, but could always be approached more closely. The perfection was what Slaanesh used. Fulgrim found a sword on a world called Leren. a Slaaneshi artifact of extraordinary craftsmanship and hidden corruption. He carried it because it was beautiful, because it was masterwork, because refusing to appreciate something magnificent simply because it was dangerous felt like a failure of aesthetic judgment. The sword whispered to him. For a long time he fought the whispers. Then one day, during a conversation with Ferrus Manus about the coming conflict, as something inside him gave way, he killed Ferrus. Then he killed Ferrus again, because the sword was still in control, and the body of his greatest friend falling wasn't enough to satisfy it. The demon inside the blade possessed him completely for a period, and when he eventually regained some measure of himself, the chaos corruption was complete. He had become a host for Slaanesh, and eventually a demon prince, and the legion he had commanded became progressively more extreme in their pursuit of sensation, of excess, of the kinds of experience that ordinary human nervous systems cannot contain. The Emperor's children in the late heresy were barely military forces in any conventional sense. They were exploration of the limits of sensation, which happened to express itself in the most violent and horrifying ways imaginable. Fulgrim exists today as a massive serpentine demon prince, bloated with Slaaneshi gifts, somewhere in the Eye of Terror. The Emperor's children that remain have fractured into warbands pursuing their own excess, but occasionally rally under his banner for operations grand enough to interest Slaanesh. The 14th Legion, the Death Guard, Mortarion. Mortarion's story is one of the strangest and saddest of all the Primarchs. He fell on Barbarous, a world almost entirely covered in a thick, toxic fog. Below the fog line, humans survived. Above it, where the fog was thickest and the toxins most concentrated, lived things that were not human. Warlords who had subjugated the population through a combination of chemical warfare and sheer malice. Mortarion grew up in the world below, a child of the fog people, and he learned to hate the things above it with a clarity that never left him. He killed the warlords one by one, each time climbing higher into the fog than the last, until only one remained at the very peak, in the thickest air. The Emperor stood at the fog line and watched. Mortarion went in anyway. He almost died up there, and the Emperor had to come in and finish the job. Mortarion never forgave that either. He had been so close. He had done everything. And at the last moment, his father stepped in and took the moment from him. He built the Death Guard around the philosophy of endurance. Not speed, not precision, not firepower. Endurance. The willingness to keep walking forward through anything. They were renowned for being essentially unkillable, for their ability to function in environments that would destroy other Space Marines, yet for a capacity to absorb punishment that bordered on supernatural. Their fortress was the quality of not stopping. During the heresy, traveling to Terra in the warp, their fleet was becalmed in a warp storm engineered by their own first captain, Callus Typhon, who had already pledged himself to Nurgle, the Chaos God of Decay. For weeks, the Death Guard drifted in the warp, unable to navigate, unable to escape, and Nurgle's rot found them there. A plague moved through the Legion that ordinary Space Marine physiology could not resist, because Nurgle had designed it specifically for them. The Death Guard suffered as they had never suffered before, reduced to agony. Their legendary endurance finally found wanting, and when Mortarion broke under it and called out into the void, Nurgle answered. They emerged from the warp as Plague Marines. So bloated, festering, stinking, partially decomposed and still walking, still fighting, because Nurgle had given them what they had always sought and twisted it into a mockery. They were unkillable now. They would never stop. But the price was their humanity and the eternal experience of rot that never quite consumed them. An existence as disgusting as it was endless. Mortarion is now a demon Primarch, a vast winged figure carrying a scythe and radiating disease that can kill entire planetary ecosystems. He is out there. He is always out there. Part 10. The second four traitors. Thousand Sons. Wordbearers. Night Lords. Iron Warriors. We spoke of the Thousand Sons already, briefly in the context of the Space Wolves, but the full tragedy of Magnus the Red deserves its proper treatment here. Magnus, the Crimson King, the Red Cyclops, of 15th Legion. He fell on Prospero, a world that had become a center of learning and psychic study, a repository of knowledge that the great civilizations of the Age of Strife had accumulated before they fell. In that environment, a Primarch who was himself an immense psychic talent, gifted with abilities that dwarfed even the most powerful human psykers, became something extraordinary. He read everything. He studied everything. He pushed the boundaries of what psychic power could do with the same obsessive energy that Fulgrim put into physical perfection or Ferrus put into craftsmanship. And his legion reflected this. The 1,000 Sons were all psykers, every single one, or nearly, because Prospero's population skewed towards psychic talent and the gene seed selected for it. But they were scholars and sorcerers and librarians as much as they were soldiers, and their approach to warfare was cerebral in ways that made other legions nervous. The flesh change was already a problem before the heresy began. The mutation in the 1,000 Sons gene seed, which had always been unstable, had been causing warriors to mutate uncontrollably since the early days of the Great Crusade. Magnus made a desperate pact with Tzeentch, sacrificing one of his eyes in exchange for a cure. He should have known better. The cure held the mutation in check temporarily, but Tzeentch never gives anything without taking more in return. Magnus was already, without fully understanding it, walking the road that leads to the Eye of Terror. At the Council of Nicaea, which was convened specifically to decide the question of psychic practice within the legions, Magnus argued his case. He lost. The Emperor ruled that unsupervised use of psychic powers by Space Marines was too dangerous, and the 1,000 Sons were specifically named in the ruling. Magnus was ordered to close his legions Librarius and cease the practice of sorcery. He agreed to the ruling. Then he used the single most dramatic psychic working in the history of the heresy to send a warning to the Emperor about Horus' corruption. His intentions were genuinely good. The warning itself was accurate and important. But in doing it, he shattered defenses the Emperor had spent decades building around the webway. Defenses meant to keep demonic entities out of a secret network of passages running through the underbelly of space. Whilst the damage was enormous, the Emperor's plans for a secret passage to connect humanity directly to the webway, plans that had occupied years of his work on Terra, were ruined in a moment. He was furious. He sent Leman Russ to bring Magnus to Terra for judgment. Horus, who understood the opportunity, changed the orders to annihilation. The Space Wolves descended on Prospero with fire and fury, and the support of the Custodes and the Sisters of Silence. And Magnus, who had foreseen the assault, who understood now what his act of well-intentioned warning had cost, did not organize a defense that could have won. He simply let them come. He had failed his father. He deserved whatever came. When the battle was already lost, Magnus raised his hands and did the only thing left to him. He tore open reality and moved the surviving 1,000 Sons to a world deep in the Eye of Terror, the planet of the sorcerers, a place Tzeentch had been preparing for them for a very long time. He pledged himself to Tzeentch, not out of love for the god of change, but out of despair and rage, and the understanding that the doors to any other path had been shut and locked and the building set on fire. In the Eye of Terror, the flesh change returned worse than ever, the proximity to chaos energies accelerating the mutations. Ahriman, the 1,000 Sons chief librarian and one of the finest psychic minds in the Imperium's history, crafted a desperate spell he called the Rubric of Ahriman. He intended it to permanently shield every member of the Legion from mutation. The spell worked, in a sense. It absolutely stopped the flesh change. But what it stopped it with was not a cure. Every member of the 1,000 Sons who lacked sufficient psychic power had his physical body reduced to dust, his soul sealed inside his power armor forever. The Rubric Marines, they are called. Empty suits walking with no body inside, animated by a soul that cannot speak or act independently, directed only by the will of a sorcerer who must give them commands. They are, by any reasonable measure, worse off than the mutations they were spared. Magnus was furious. He banished Ahriman from the planet of the sorcerers. He is still in the Eye of Terror, a vast winged demon prince with a single cyclopean eye and power so immense that he can reach out from the warp and crush planets. He attacks Fenris with regularity, seeking revenge on the Space Wolves for what was done to Prospero. He leads his legion of sorcerers and hollow suits toward goals that even Tzeentch, the god he serves, may not fully understand. Ahriman wanders. He seeks the Black Library of the Eldar, where all secrets are kept. He seeks, still, after 10,000 years, a way to undo what he did to the Thousand Sons. Perhaps he always will. The 17th Legion, the Word-Bearers. Lorgar. Lorgar of Colchis was not a fighter in the way that Horus was a fighter or Russ was a fighter. He was a prophet. He fell on a world already given to intense religious fervor, was taken in by the priesthood, and grew up in the burning certainty that there were powers in the universe deserving of worship. When the Emperor came and revealed himself, Lorgar's response was to fall to his knees in genuine ecstasy. He had been right. There was a god. And the god had arrived. For decades, Lorgar led his legion through the Great Crusade, not as a military operation, but as a religious mission, building temples and writing sacred texts on every world they brought to compliance. Every world that the word-bearers pacified received the word of the Emperor. Every world was given a doctrine. The Emperor was God, and Lorgar was his high priest. Then the Emperor came to Monarchia. Monarchia was a world that the word-bearers had built into a monument to the Emperor's divinity over the course of 50 years. Cathedrals, monuments, a city that was entirely a prayer in stone and stained light. The Emperor arrived with the Ultramarines and the Custodes, and he ordered Lorgar and his men to kneel in the rubble of Monarchia as the entire city was obliterated from orbit. The message was simple. The Emperor was not a god. He had never claimed to be a god. He found the idea offensive and dangerous. The imperial truth was secular, rational, material. There were no gods. There was no divinity. The universe ran on comprehensible physical laws, and psychic energy was a science, not a miracle. Lorgar heard this message and broke, not violently and immediately, but in the specific, terrifying way of someone whose entire foundation has been taken away. He took his legion on a pilgrimage, a decades-long journey to the edges of known space, searching for something worthy of the worship that had been burning in him since childhood. And in the warp, he found it. Not the Emperor, not something that claimed to be benevolent, something that wanted his faith and was willing to give him real power in return. By the time Lorgar returned from the pilgrimage, the word-bearers were already servants of chaos undivided. Lorgar had been working toward the heresy for decades before Horus even began his fall. The manipulation at Davin, the corruption of Horus through the serpent lodges, the entire architecture of the betrayal. These were Lorgar's blueprints. He did not just betray the Emperor, he invented the betrayal. He is a demon prince now, sitting in contemplation on a distant world, waiting for whatever comes next. Of all the traitor Primarchs, he may be the most content with where he ended up. He found his gods. They are terrible. He does not seem to mind. The 8th Legion, the Night Lords, Konrad Curze. There is no redemption arc for Konrad Curze. There is no moment where his motives become understandable in a sympathetic way. But there is only a long slide from something already deeply wrong into something genuinely monstrous. He fell on Nostramo, a world of permanent night, the sun too dim to provide any meaningful light to the surface. Nostramo was, accordingly, a world of crime, of shadow economies, and brutal underclasses, and aristocrats who maintain power through terror. Curze grew up alone in that darkness, and his psychic gifts showed him the future, specifically the worst possible futures, an endless parade of suffering and death and violence. He was, from the very beginning, a being for whom hope was essentially absent. He knew how everything was going to end. He brought order to Nostramo the only way he could believe would work, which was through fear so absolute that no criminal would dare commit a crime. He impaled people. He left bodies displayed in public places as warnings. He created a regime of terror so effective that Nostramo became, by every measurable economic metric, one of the most peaceful and productive worlds in the sector. You can argue, and people do, about whether the method was worth the result. When the Emperor arrived and gave him the Night Lord's Legion, he brought his methods with him. The Night Lords specialized in psychological warfare, in terror, in the specific kind of horror that makes an entire civilian population surrender before a single weapon is fired. They would skin people alive and wear the skins. They would flood Vox channels with the recorded screams of the dying. They would arrive at night and leave no survivors. They were effective. They were also not something that any stable civilization should be resting on as a pillar of policy. The Emperor eventually lost patience and ordered Kersey to face judgment for his methods. Kersey, who had already been shown a vision of his own death, a vision where an assassin killed him with a knife while he sat entirely willing to receive the blow, joined Horus's cause, partly out of nihilism, and partly because it meant avoiding the judgment he knew was coming. He fought through the heresy with spectacular viciousness, most notably in the protracted campaign against the Dark Angels, and in his personal vendetta against Vulcan, whom he tortured repeatedly during a captivity that lasted years. He died eventually, exactly as he had foreseen. An Imperial assassin called Meshen found him sitting in his ruined throne, in the dark, reading, and then killed him with a single blade. He did not resist. He had known it would end this way. He had always known. The Night Lords in the 41st Millennium are not a unified legion. They are war bands of terror specialists who prey on everything they encounter, owing allegiance to no one, not even to chaos directly. They are the darkness between the stars that smells of old blood. The 4th Legion. The Iron Warriors. Perturabo. The relationship between the Iron Warriors and the Imperial Fists is one of the most specifically toxic things in the entire history of the legions. It is an enmity built on exactly one thing. Perturabo believed, with an obsessive fury that colored everything he did, that the Imperial Fists received the glory and recognition that the Iron Warriors deserved, that Rogel Dawn, who held walls, Gez got the songs and the statues and the gratitude of the galaxy, while Perturabo, who took them, got nothing but more orders to go take more fortified positions. Perturabo was, objectively, extraordinary. His tactical and engineering genius was unmatched. He could look at any fortress and find the point where it was weakest, the exact caliber of weapon to use at the exact angle at which to apply it, the sequence of operations that would crack any defense in minimum time with minimum casualties. He was given, accordingly, all of the siege work, all of the grinding, attritional, unglamorous hard work of the Great Crusade that nobody wanted to do, but that had to be done. He was never given the honor operations, never given the glory assignments, and he felt every single one of those slights with the intensity of someone keeping a very detailed ledger. He also purged his own legion, 1 in every 10 Iron Warriors, after a catastrophic action against a relatively minor rebellion that had cost embarrassing casualties, was executed in a ceremony of punishment. He did it himself. He walked down the line and killed every 10th man. His sons never forgot this, and their relationship with him afterward had a quality of coerced loyalty rather than genuine devotion that would eventually become a serious problem. He joined Horus because Horus offered him Dawn's head. That is a simplified version, but it is not entirely wrong. The opportunity to finally be acknowledged as superior to the Imperial Fists was enough. The Iron Warrior's current status in the Eye of Terror involves Perturabo himself, who is a demon prince, sitting in an enormous fortress he has spent 10,000 years constructing and improving, always approaching, but never quite reaching his standard of perfection. He is not at peace. He has never been at peace. He probably never will be. The fortress grows. The work continues. It is enough to do the work. It has to be. Part 11. The Alpha Legion. We are all Alpharius, and then there is the 20th Legion. I have left them until last among the traitors because they are, genuinely, the most complicated thing in the entire history of the legions. They are the Alpha Legion, and the question of whether they are actually traitors is one that the Warhammer 40,000 universe refuses to definitively answer. As that ambiguity is not a narrative weakness, it is the whole point. Alpharius Omegon, the twin Primarchs. This is the first thing. There are 2 of them. Alpharius and Omegon, twins, both primarchs of the 20th Legion, a fact they kept secret even from the Emperor for essentially their entire careers. They would swap places. They would send one twin to complete a mission under the other's name. Every member of the Legion was trained to claim to be Alpharius if asked, because the Legion operated as a single distributed intelligence rather than a traditional command hierarchy. Every Alpha Legionnaire was, in a sense, all of them simultaneously. The Cabal found them. The Cabal was a Xenos organization, ancient beyond any human reckoning. Actually, that had been studying the development of chaos across multiple civilizations across millions of years. They had run the models. They had done the calculations, and their conclusion was this: if Horus won the heresy, humanity would be destroyed in 2 generations, but the destruction would be so complete that it would drag the Chaos Gods down with it. If the Emperor won, humanity would persist for 10 or 20,000 years, before eventually being consumed by chaos anyway. From a purely utilitarian perspective, the mathematics favored Horus winning. Alpharius Omegon apparently accepted this reasoning, or at least they claimed to. The Alpha Legion joined the traitors, and their contributions to the heresy were significant. They were central to the strategy at Istvan V. They nearly destroyed the Space Wolves at the Alaxis Nebula. They infiltrated the Raven Guard and corrupted the gene seed samples Korax had been using to rebuild his legion. But also, Omegon, seemingly unilaterally, destroyed the jamming array that was preventing the White Scars from receiving communications about Horus's betrayal, effectively ensuring that Jagatai Khan would come to Terra, making sure that a major loyalist legion would be available for the final defense. This does not fit with the strategy of helping Horus win. Alpharius himself was apparently killed by Rogel Dawn at Pluto during the early stages of the Solar War. Dawn refused to make this death public, because acknowledging that the Alpha Legion Primarch had died would give the Alpha Legion martyrdom and information they did not need to have. Omegon took over the management of the Legion permanently. Whether any of this reflects genuine loyalty to the Emperor, or a different calculation than the one presented to the Cabal, or something else entirely, is a question the lore answers with the most honest possible response, which is that nobody knows. Not even, perhaps, the Alpha Legion. Alpharius Omegon are possibly the most unsatisfying and most truthful characters in the entire setting. They are a reminder that the people actually in the room where decisions are made sometimes have reasons that do not fit cleanly into the narratives constructed afterward by historians. The Alpha Legion did not retreat to the Eye of Terror after the heresy. They went east. New objectives, new operations. 10,000 years later, they are still out there, still running cells in Imperial and Chaos territories alike, and still pursuing goals that nobody outside the Alpha Legion fully understands, still answering to a command structure that outsiders cannot penetrate. Are we Alpharius? We are all Alpharius. Part 12, The Siege of Terror, the End of the Age. The Siege of Terror, the climax of the Horus heresy, the event that defines the setting in ways that reach into every corner of the 41st millennium. Horus brought his forces to the solar system. The traitor fleet was enormous, the largest concentration of Chaos-Touch military power that had ever been assembled in one place. 7 traitor legions massed in the void above humanity's cradle world. The Imperial Palace, Rogel Dawn's masterwork of fortification, became the last real barrier between Horus and the Golden Throne. Months of brutal siege, the palace's walls held, as they were built to hold. But holding a wall is different from winning, and the traitor forces were so numerous and their weapons so terrible that the defenders, however heroic, could not ultimately prevail through attrition alone. The palace was failing, section by section. The outer walls were falling, the inner keeps were under fire. The Emperor, on the Golden Throne, poured psychic energy into the defenses, but he could not leave without abandoning the Webway project that was the only thing keeping the entire psychic infrastructure of his government operational. Sanguinius arrived with the Blood Angels. The White Scars arrived. The loyalist forces defending the palace were reinforced enough to slow the bleeding, but not to stop it entirely. And then Horus made a decision. he lowered the shields on his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit. Each deliberately. It may have been arrogance, an invitation to come and face him directly, or it may have been something Chaos had done to him. A subtle corruption of his judgment that made the gesture feel like confidence and act like suicide. The Emperor understood the invitation. He teleported aboard the Vengeful Spirit. Dawn went with him, and Sanguinius was already aboard after having been separated from the main force in earlier fighting. Sanguinius found Horus first. What happened between them is recorded in fragments. They had been among the closest of brothers once. Something in Sanguinius had always known this moment was coming. He had dreamed it. He had perhaps chosen, on some level, to come to the Vengeful Spirit for exactly this reason. He faced Horus, and he died. The wave of psychic grief from his death hit every blood angel simultaneously and would never fully fade from their gene seed. The Emperor found Horus over the body of Sanguinius. What followed was the battle to end all battles. The Emperor and the War Master, father and son, the most powerful psyker in the history of humanity, against someone who had been, once, the closest thing in the galaxy to an equal. The Chaos Gods had poured their power into Horus. He was not just a Primarch anymore. He was a vessel for the ruinous powers, so filled with warp energy that the Emperor's strikes barely registered. The Emperor was losing, mortally wounded, near death. He saw Horus clearly in that moment. Not the monster, the man, the boy he had made, the son he had loved, the War Master he had trusted above all others. And through whatever psychic faculty the Emperor possessed beyond human understanding, he reached inside the corruption and found the remnant of Horus's soul. Found that there was still something left in there that was not chaos, and he showed that remnant what had been done to it. The crimes committed in its name. The billions dead. The brothers corrupted. Horus hesitated. For one fraction of a second, he hesitated. The Emperor struck with everything he had. The resulting discharge of psychic energy was so enormous that it destroyed Horus completely. Not just killed him, but annihilated his soul so thoroughly that chaos could not reconstruct him, could not bring him back. He was gone. But the Emperor was gone too. He was alive, technically, but only technically. His body was beyond repair. His wounds were beyond any healing art. Dawn found him on the bridge of the Vengeful Spirit and brought him back to Terra, to the Golden Throne, where the most intricate life support system ever built was modified to sustain what remained. He breathed, his heart beat, he sat enthroned in state, drawing immense psychic energy through the throne to power the Astronomicon, the great psychic lighthouse that allows navigators to guide ships through the warp across the breadth of the galaxy. He does not speak. He does not communicate. He may be dreaming or dying very slowly, or simply existing in a state no human has words for. He has been there for 10,000 years. The bodies of 10 psykers are burned to sustain him every single day. He does not wake up. He does not die. This is the Imperium, built on a living corpse, sustained by sacrifice, fighting a war that never ends for a god who cannot acknowledge what is being done in his name. Part 13. The Codex Astartes and the New Age. In the aftermath of the heresy, with the traitor legions broken and driven back through the Eye of Terror, in the great campaign known as the Scouring, a new order had to be built. And Guilliman, the Primarch who had spent his entire career building things, took it on himself to build it. The Codex Astartes. We spoke of this earlier, but the full weight of it deserves a moment. The argument Guilliman made was simple and inarguable. The heresy had only been possible because Space Marine legions were too powerful. Any single commander who had the loyalty of an entire legion had the power to threaten the Imperium itself. Horus had proven that. 9 legions had fallen. Yet the only way to ensure that no single military force could ever again threaten the Imperium's existence from within was to ensure that no such force could ever again exist. The legions would be broken into chapters of 1,000 warriors each. Each chapter would be a self-contained military unit, fully equipped and independent. No chapter would ever muster its full strength beside the full strength of another without explicit Imperial command and oversight. The power was distributed, the risk was managed, most Primarchs agreed, some with great reluctance. Rogel Dawn refused initially, believing the gesture was a slight to his legion's honor and a repudiation of the Fist's sacrifice at the Siege of Terra. He was eventually persuaded. The Space Wolves never fully complied, maintaining a legion-like structure in all but name. But most chapters of the Adeptus Astartes in the 41st Millennium trace their organization back to this document. Each Loyalist legion became a first founding chapter and its gene-sons. The Dark Angels split into the Unforgiven, all sharing the secret of the Fallen. The Space Wolves formed the Wolf Brothers, who later collapsed from gene seed instability. The Imperial Fists split into 3 chapters, the Crimson Fists and the Black Templars alongside the original chapter. The Blood Angels created a brotherhood of successor chapters that share the floor. The Ultramarines split into over a dozen successor chapters, from the original founding alone, more than any other legion. The Traitor Legions became the Chaos Space Marines, broken into warbands that prey on the edges of Imperial space, who are running the long war that Abaddon the Despoiler orchestrates from the Eye of Terror in massive campaigns called Black Crusades, of which there have been 13. The 13th, which unfolded in the standard year 999 Emson 41, opened the Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, the massive warp tear that now splits the galaxy roughly in half. The Imperium became Imperium Nihilus, the Dark Imperium, the half cut off from the light of the Astronomicon, and the Imperium Sanctus, which still has contact with Terra, but is surrounded by enemies on every side. And into this shattered galaxy, Guilliman returned. He is the Lord Commander now. He has seen what 10,000 years of his absence produced. He has seen the corruption of the institutions he built, the calcification of the administratum into something that chokes under its own weight, at the misuse of his codex by commanders who follow the letter rather than the spirit, the willful misunderstanding of his intentions by institutions that would rather have unquestionable doctrine than adaptable wisdom. He is trying to fix it. He is building Primaris Space Marines, a new generation of even more advanced warriors designed by Archmagos Belisarius Cawl, using research that began decades before the heresy and continued in secret throughout the millennia. He is issuing new doctrines, new directives, trying to reach across 10,000 years of institutional inertia and make something that works. The Lion returned too, waking from the rock after 10 millennia of sleep. 2 Primarchs are active in the galaxy, fighting to hold back the darkness. Whether it is enough, whether this shattered and bleeding Imperium can survive what is coming, whether the sacrifice of billions of lives over 10,000 years amounts to something more than delay. These are questions the 41st Millennium has not yet answered. The war goes on. The Chaos Gods play their long games. The Xenos press in from every direction. The Great Rift bleeds darkness across the stars. But the Space Marines fight. They have always fought. They were made for this. The 18. A final accounting before we close. Let me give you the roll call. The full accounting of where each legion began, who led it, and where the current era finds it. The First Legion, the Dark Angels, Primarch Lion L. Johnson, now awake and active in the 41st Millennium. Their successor chapters are collectively called the Unforgiven. Their fortress monastery is the Rock. Their secret is the Fallen. The Second Legion, number and name unknown. Lost before the heresy. All records erased. Nothing remains. The Third Legion, the Emperor's Children. Primarch Fulgrim, now a demon prince of Slaanesh. The Legion has fragmented into pleasure-seeking warbands pursuing excess without limit. The Fourth Legion, the Iron Warriors. Primarch Perturabo, now a demon prince of Chaos Undivided. The Legion specializes in siege warfare. They are found wherever fortifications must be broken. The Fifth Legion, the White Scars. Primarch Jagatai Khan, missing in the webway. The chapter fights on Chagoris and across the galaxy, fast and ferocious, honoring the memory of their Khan, the 6th Legion, the Space Wolves, Primarch Lehman Russ. She missing since his departure into the Eye of Terror in 211 M31. The chapter refuses to fully comply with the Codex Astartes and remains at the Fang on Fenris, waiting for the Wolf Time. The 7th Legion, the Imperial Fists, Primarch Rogol Dawn, presumed dead, last seen on the Sword of Sacrilege. The chapter defends humanity from their fortress ship Phalanx and across the galaxy. The 8th Legion, the Night Lords, Primarch Conrad Kurz, assassinated by the Imperial assassin Meshen at his own invitation. The Legion has shattered into terror warbands with no unified leadership. The 9th Legion, the Blood Angels, Primarch Sanguinius, killed by Horus at the Siege of Terror. The chapter fights on with the dual burdens of the Red Thirst and the Black Rage, led by Commander Dante. The 10th Legion, the Iron Hands, Primarch Ferrus Manus, was killed at the drop site massacre of Istvan Futh, the first loyalist Primarch to fall in the heresy. The chapter continues his philosophy of flesh replaced by steel. The 11th Legion, number and name unknown, lost before the heresy. All records erased, nothing remains. The 12th Legion, the World Eaters, Primarch Angron, now a demon prince of Khorne. The Legion is shattered into Khornate warbands, briefly unifying under the Red Angel's banner for great massacres. The 13th Legion, the Ultramarines, Primarch Reboot Gilliman, resurrected and now Lord Commander of the Imperium. The most numerous legion in history, now the most numerous set of successor chapters. The 14th Legion, the Death Guard, Primarch Mortarion, now a demon prince of Nurgle. The Legion marches rotting and unstoppable, spreading plague across the galaxy. Chad the 15th Legion, the Thousand Suns, Primarch Magnus the Red, now a demon prince of Tsench. Most of the Legion are rubric marines, hollow suits animated by trapped souls. Ahriman wanders eternally. The 16th Legion, originally the Lunar Wolves and then the Sons of Horus. After Horus's destruction, renamed the Black Legion by Abaddon the Despoiler. The largest and most organized chaos force in the galaxy, having launched 13 Black Crusades against the Imperium. The 17th Legion, the Word-Bearers, Primarch Lorga Aurelian, now a demon prince sitting in contemplation. The Legion is the great missionaries of chaos, spreading its dark gospel wherever they travel. The 18th Legion, the Salamanders, Primarch Vulcan, alive but missing after departing on a personal quest. The chapter continues his legacy of compassion and craftsmanship from their homeworld Nocturne. The 19th Legion, the Raven Guard, Primarch Corvus Corax, missing after departing into the Eye of Terror alone. The chapter continues his philosophy of shadow warfare from Deliverance. The 20th Legion, the Alpha Legion, Primarchs Alpharius and Omegon. Alpharius killed at Pluto during the Solar War. Omegon's current status unknown. The Legion's true allegiance remains unresolved. They operate across the galaxy, on both sides of the war, following an agenda that may or may not still serve the Emperor's original purpose. 18 legions, 9 loyal, 9 traitors, or possibly 8.5 traitors and one enormous, unanswerable question. Thousands of years of history packed into 20 individuals who were each, in their own way, it's the product of their father's genius, and a galaxy too complicated for any genius to fully account for. A final word: you have been with me for a long time tonight, through the laboratories beneath the Himalayas, and the death world of Fenris, and the black sands of Istvan Futh, and the burning spires of Prospero, through the corridors of the vengeful spirit, and the walls of the imperial palace, through 10,000 years of war and grief and complicated loyalty. What strikes me most about the story of the Legions, when I hold all of it in my mind at once, is how much of it is about relationships, not military strategy or tactical doctrine, or the political history of institutions. Those things matter, and we have spent time on them. But underneath all of it, the story of the 18 legions is the story of fathers and sons who did not understand each other, brothers who could not bridge the distance between them, friends who let small slights become great wounds before it was too late to heal them. The Emperor loved his sons, but he never told them this. He created them as instruments and treated them sometimes as if their primary value was strategic. The Primarchs needed more than he gave them and could not say so, because how do you tell your father, who made you to be superhuman, that you need to be loved? Horus needed to hear that his father was proud of him. Magnus needed to hear that he would be protected. Angron needed to know that someone understood what had been done to him. Lorgar needed to be told that the faith he was trying to give was not unwanted, only misdirected. None of these things were said, or not enough of them, or not in the right way. The Imperium exists in the 41st millennium as a monument to what happens when the foundations of a civilization include that many unhealed fractures. It is magnificent. It is terrible. It is a structure built by people who were doing their best with what they had, and their best was extraordinary, and it was not enough. But the Space Marines fight on. The Lion is awake. Guilliman is at work. The Salamanders still care about the people they fight for. The Blood Angels still mourn Sanguinius and carry his legacy of beauty and sorrow and stubborn refusal to stop. The Space Wolves still wait for their king. There is something in that. Something that refuses, despite everything, to be extinguished. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But there are also warriors who remember what they are fighting for. And that is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. Thank you for spending time in this universe with me. If you have found something here that made you want to know more, to go deeper into any of these threads and see what more is there, then this has been time well spent for both of us. If you are new to the channel and this is your introduction to QAnon 40k, welcome. There is so much more to explore, and we explore it slowly, carefully, the way this kind of story deserves. Hit subscribe so you know when the next one arrives. And if you have questions, or a legion you want to hear more about, or a story from the Horus heresy that has been sitting in your mind since you first encountered it, leave it in the comments, as these conversations are part of what makes this worth doing. The next light on the horizon might be a long time coming, but it is coming. Take care of yourselves, and we will see you next time.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.